In the year 2000, the president of Iraq made an announcement that barely made the news. He declared that Iraq would no longer sell its oil in US dollars. Instead, every barrel of Iraqi crude would be priced in euros. 3 years later, the United States invaded his country, toppled his government, and Saddam Hussein was pulled from a hole in the ground, put on trial, and hanged. In 2009, the leader of Libya stood before the United Nations and proposed something even more radical, a brand new gold-backed currency for the entire African continent. 2 years later, NATO bombed his country into rubble, and Muammar Gaddafi was dragged through the streets and killed. In 2023, Iran began demanding that its oil be purchased exclusively in Chinese Yuan, not dollars, not euros, yuan. Today, Iran is at war with the United States of America. 3 leaders, 3 continents, 3 decades. All 3 challenged the same system. All 3 paid the ultimate price. This is either the greatest coincidence in modern history, or there is an unwritten rule in the global order that no leader is allowed to break. A rule that says if you sell oil, you sell it in US dollars, and if you don't, you will be destroyed. To understand why this pattern exists and why it keeps repeating, you need to understand the most important financial agreement most people have never heard of. An agreement that turned the US dollar into a dying currency, into the most powerful financial weapon in human history. The year was 1971. The United States was spending enormous amounts of money fighting the Vietnam War, funding social programs, and expanding its military presence across the globe. To pay for all of this, the government was printing dollars at an alarming rate. But there was a problem. At the time, the US dollar was backed by gold. Every dollar in circulation was supposed to represent a fixed amount of gold sitting in vaults at Fort Knox. The promise was simple. Any country holding US dollars could walk up to the window and exchange those dollars for real, physical gold. But America had printed far more dollars than it had gold to back them. Countries started to notice. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, began aggressively converting its dollar reserves back into gold, literally shipping gold bars across the Atlantic. Other nations prepared to do the same. The United States was facing a catastrophic gold drain that would have exposed the dollar as fundamentally worthless. So on August 15, 1971, President Nixon went on national television and made one of the most consequential announcements in economic history. He suspended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold. The gold window was closed permanently. Overnight, the US dollar became a fiat currency. It was backed by nothing. No gold, no silver, no tangible asset of any kind, just paper and the full faith and credit of the United States government, whatever that meant. This created an immediate crisis. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, why would any country on earth want to hold it? Why would Japan, Germany, Brazil, or anyone else keep billions of dollars in their reserves if those dollars were just pieces of paper backed by a promise? The demand for dollars would collapse, inflation would spiral out of control, and American economic dominance would be over. The Nixon administration needed a new source of global demand for the dollar. They needed something that every country on earth had to buy. Something so essential that no nation could function without it. That something was oil.
In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and negotiated what would become the most important financial agreement of the 20th century. The deal was straightforward but brilliant. Saudi Arabia the world's largest oil exporter, would agree to price all of its oil exports exclusively in US dollars, not in Saudi riyals, not in a basket of currencies, only dollars. In return, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with complete military protection, weapons, and a guarantee of regime security. But the deal went further than just Saudi Arabia. Through American diplomatic pressure, this arrangement was extended to the entire Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Within a few years, virtually every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world was priced and traded in US dollars. The implications of this were staggering. Think about what this means. Every country on Earth needs oil. You cannot run a modern economy without it. You cannot heat homes, fuel transportation, generate electricity, manufacture goods, or feed a population without oil. And if every barrel of oil must be purchased in US dollars, then every country on Earth must acquire and hold massive reserves of US dollars just to keep functioning. Japan needs dollars. Germany needs dollars. India needs dollars. Brazil needs dollars. Even China, the second largest economy in the world, needs dollars. Not because they want them, but because without dollars, they cannot buy the energy that keeps their civilization running. And what do countries do with all those excess dollars sitting in their reserves? They invest them. They buy U.S. Treasury bonds. They buy American real estate. They pour money into U.S. stock markets. This creates a constant, massive, global flow of capital into the United States. It allows the American government to run enormous budget deficits, fund the world's largest military, and maintain a standard of living that would otherwise be impossible. This is the PetroDollar system, and it is not an exaggeration to say that it is the single most important pillar holding up American global power. Now, with that understanding, let us revisit the three leaders who tried to tear this pillar down. Case number 1, Saddam Hussein and Iraq. In November 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would no longer accept US dollars for its oil exports under the United Nations Oil for Food program. Instead, Iraq would price its oil in euros. At the time, this was seen as a largely symbolic and somewhat eccentric move by a dictator who was already at odds with Washington. The mainstream media barely covered it. Financial analysts dismissed it as irrelevant. But it was anything but irrelevant. Iraq held the fifth largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 145 billion barrels of crude sitting beneath the desert. If Iraq successfully transitioned to euro-denominated oil sales, it would set a precedent. Other oil-producing nations, many of whom were quietly frustrated with American monetary hegemony, were watching carefully. If Iraq could do it, so could Iran, so could Venezuela, so could Russia. The entire OPEC cartel might follow. And here is the part that most people do not know. Iraq actually made money on the switch. The euro appreciated against the dollar during this period, meaning Iraq's oil revenues actually increased by converting to euros. Other nations noticed this too. The domino effect had to be stopped before it started. In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The official justification was weapons of mass destruction. Intelligence reports, we were told, confirmed that Saddam Hussein possessed chemical and biological weapons and was actively pursuing nuclear weapons. This was the reason presented to the United Nations. This was the reason given to the American public. This was the reason printed on every front page in the Western world. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. Not a single one. The intelligence was later acknowledged to be fundamentally flawed and in some cases deliberately fabricated. The Iraq Survey Group, The organization specifically tasked with finding these weapons after the invasion concluded definitively that Iraq had dismantled its weapons programs years earlier. But something else happened almost immediately after the fall of Baghdad, something that received almost no media attention whatsoever. One of the very first economic actions taken by the U.S.-backed interim government was to switch Iraqi oil sales back from euros to U.S. dollars. This happened in June 2003, just 3 months after the invasion began, and long before any semblance of democracy or stability had been established. The euro experiment was over. The dollar was restored. Saddam Hussein was captured in December 2003, tried by an Iraqi tribunal, and executed by hanging in December 2006. The message was clear. Whether it was intended as a message or not, the result was unmistakable. Iraq challenged the dollar, and Iraq was destroyed. But if Iraq was a warning shot, Libya was the moment the pattern became impossible to ignore. Case number 2, Muammar Gaddafi and Libya. Gaddafi had ruled Libya for over 40 decades. Love him or hate him, under his leadership, Libya had achieved the highest human development index in all of Africa. Free healthcare, free education, subsidized housing, the highest literacy rate on the continent. Libya was, by African standards, a prosperous and functional state. But Gaddafi had a vision that went far beyond Libya. In 2009, in his capacity as chairman of the African Union, Gaddafi proposed the creation of a unified African currency called the gold dinar. This was not a theoretical exercise. Gaddafi had a specific and detailed plan. The gold dinar would be backed by gold, real, physical gold. And Libya had been quietly accumulating gold reserves for years. At the time of NATO's intervention, Libya held approximately 143.8 tons of gold. The gold dinar was designed to do 2 things. First, it would be the currency used by all African nations to sell oil and natural resources. Africa holds roughly 30% of the world's mineral resources, including oil, uranium, cobalt, diamonds, gold, and coltan, which is essential for every smartphone and computer on the planet. Pricing all of this in a gold-backed African currency would be transformative. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the gold dinar would liberate West and Central Africa from the CFA franc, a currency controlled by the French treasury that had kept 14 African nations in a state of effective monetary colonialism since 1945. Under the CFA system, these African countries were required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves with the French treasury. Gaddafi's gold dinar would end this arrangement overnight. Multiple African heads of state had expressed support for the plan. The African Union was actively discussing implementation. Gaddafi was not just talking, he was building. And this is where the story takes a turn that moves from pattern recognition to documented evidence. In 2016, following a legal investigation, a batch of Hillary Clinton's emails from her time as Secretary of State were declassified and made public. Among them was a communication from Sidney Blumenthal, a close advisor, which explicitly identified Gaddafi's gold reserves and his plans for a gold-backed Pan-African currency as a direct threat to French financial interests in Africa. The email named the gold dinar. It named the threat to the CFA franc. It connected these directly to the French push for military intervention. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a declassified United States government document available for anyone to read. In March 2011, NATO launched Operation Unified Protector. The official justification was humanitarian intervention, the protection of Libyan civilians from their own government.
NATO aircraft flew over 26,000 sorties. Libya's military infrastructure was systematically destroyed. On October 20, 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was captured by rebel forces in his hometown of Sirte and killed. When news of Gaddafi's death reached Washington, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was captured on camera in a now infamous moment. She smiled and said, quote, "We came, we saw, he died," end quote, and then she laughed. The gold dinar died with Gaddafi. Libya's gold reserves disappeared into the chaos of a failed state. Today, Libya has no functioning central government. It has open-air slave markets where African migrants are bought and sold.
The country that once had the highest standard of living in Africa is now a symbol of total civilizational collapse. Africa's bid for monetary independence was set back by decades, perhaps generations, and the petrodollar survived. Two leaders had now challenged the dollar's monopoly on oil. One proposed euros, one proposed gold. Both were destroyed. Both had their oil switched back to dollar pricing. Both served as examples to every other oil-producing nation on Earth. But then came a third challenge, and this one is different.
Case number 3, Iran and the Chinese Yuan. Iran has been on a collision course with the petrodollar system for nearly 2 decades. In 2008, Iran opened its own oil bourse, a trading exchange specifically designed to facilitate oil transactions in currencies other than the US dollar. In 2012, Iran began accepting Chinese Yuan and Indian rupees for its oil exports. By 2018, Iran had formally dropped the US dollar from all foreign trade. And in 2023, Iran took the most aggressive step yet. It began demanding that oil shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical energy choke points on the planet, be traded exclusively in Chinese yuan. This was a direct, unmistakable declaration of war against the petrodollar. Not a metaphorical war, an actual economic assault on the system that underpins American financial dominance. And the United States responded with military force. But here is where the pattern breaks, because Iran is not Iraq, and Iran is not Libya. Iraq, at the time of the 2003 invasion, had a population of roughly 25 million and a military that had been devastated by a decade of sanctions. Libya had a population of just 6 million. These were, in military terms, relatively manageable targets. Iran has a population of 88 million people. Its land area is more than 4 times the size of Iraq. Its terrain is dominated by mountain ranges that make ground invasion extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, developing asymmetric warfare capabilities specifically designed to counter American military superiority. Consider the mathematics of this conflict. Iran deploys commercially available drones that cost approximately $50,000 each. To intercept a single one of these drones, the United States and its allies fire interceptor missiles that cost between $2 and $10 million each. For every $50,000 drone Iran launches, America spends up to $10 million to shoot it down. This is a ratio of 200 to 1. It is an economic war of attrition that the United States cannot sustain indefinitely. Iran has also demonstrated the ability to penetrate some of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. Its True Promise operations utilized hypersonic missiles, drone swarms numbering in the hundreds, and electronic decoys with erratic flight paths designed to overwhelm and confuse systems like the Iron Dome, Patriot batteries, and the Aegis naval defense system. And then there is Iran's ultimate leverage, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, carries approximately 21% of all globally traded oil. But it is not just oil. 40% of the world's helium supply comes from Qatar, and that helium must pass through the strait. Helium is essential for semiconductor manufacturing,
MRI machines, and scientific research. A blockade of the Strait of Hormuz would not just spike oil prices, it would threaten the global chip industry, which means it would threaten artificial intelligence development, consumer electronics, automotive manufacturing, and military technology. Iran also sits within the BRICS alliance alongside China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. An attack on Iran is not an attack on an isolated dictator. It is a confrontation with a coalition representing roughly 40% of the world's population and over a quarter of global GDP. The pattern is repeating. Iran challenged the dollar. The military response has begun. But Iran has made itself strong enough that the pattern may not be able to complete itself this time. And Iran is not alone in this challenge. Venezuela, which holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 303 billion barrels, began exploring non-dollar oil sales under Hugo Chavez in the early 2000s. The result was relentless economic sanctions, multiple coup attempts, and the most aggressive financial isolation in the Western Hemisphere. Syria's Bashar al-Assad refused to allow a proposed Qatar-Turkey natural gas pipeline through his territory, a pipeline that would have strengthened dollar-denominated energy infrastructure. He chose instead to support an alternative Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline. The result was a devastating civil war and ongoing U.S. military presence on Syrian soil. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, demanded that European nations pay for natural gas in Russian rubles rather than dollars or euros. The result was the freezing of approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves and the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy. Let me put all of this together. Saddam Hussein challenged the dollar with euros. His country was invaded and he was executed. Muammar Gaddafi challenged the dollar with gold. His country was bombed and he was killed. Hugo Chavez challenged the dollar with alternative currencies. His country was sanctioned and destabilized. Bashar al-Assad defied dollar-denominated energy infrastructure. His country was torn apart by civil war. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, demanded that rubles be paid for gas. His reserves were frozen and a proxy war erupted. Iran is demanding yuan for oil. Iran is now at war with the United States. At what point does a pattern become a policy? But here is what most people covering this story get wrong. They focus on which currency will replace the dollar. Will it be the yuan, a BRICS currency, gold, Bitcoin? They miss the deeper transformation that is quietly, irreversibly underway. The PetroDollar system is built on one foundational assumption, that every country on Earth needs to buy oil. Take away that need, and the entire system collapses, no matter what currency oil is priced in. And that's exactly what is happening. Every wind turbine erected on a coastline is a barrel of oil that does not need to be purchased. Every solar panel installed on a rooftop is a transaction that does not need to be conducted in US dollars. Denmark now generates over 55% of its electricity from wind. It does not need to negotiate with Saudi Arabia for its energy. It does not need permission from Washington. It does not need to participate in the PetroDollar system at all. Costa Rica runs on 99% renewable energy. Iceland powers itself with geothermal heat from its own volcanoes. Portugal, Scotland, Uruguay, they are all moving toward energy independence through renewables, and every single one of them is quietly, without firing a shot, without invading anyone, without being bombed, withdrawing from the system that has controlled the global economy for 50 years. You can invade a country that switches to euros. You can bomb a country that proposes a gold currency. You can sanction a country that demands rubles, but you cannot bomb the wind. You cannot sanction sunlight. You cannot invade a solar panel on someone's roof. The leaders who challenged the petrodollar with alternative currencies were destroyed because currencies can be tracked, controlled, and punished. But energy independence through renewables is decentralized,
unstoppable and invisible to the very mechanisms of financial warfare that enforce the dollar system. The petrodollar was built on oil. It was enforced through war, and it will be ended not by a rival currency, not by a military alliance, not by a dictator with a gold coin, but by the quiet, relentless, and irreversible transition to energy that does not require a single dollar to produce. That's the story nobody else is telling, and it's the most important story of our time. The future of money is the future of energy, and the future of energy does not run on oil.